Okay, punks, I'm a good sport, so I'm going to let our enemies, the Linehammer deniers, and those Games Workshop sycophants who can't take blistering criticism about Warhammer the Old World, live a little longer. Instead, let's talk wargaming philosophy. I did a little podcast on Spirit of the Game the other day, and that got me thinking about that venerable and beautiful treatise, Stillmania, penned by the legendary Nigel Stillman in White Dwarf in 1998. To those of you who don't think that a 26-year-old column is at the centre of the hobby debate, you're wrong. Because Old World, and indeed modern 40k and any other gaming system, is full of debate about competitive play, spirit of the game, and gentlemanly conduct. Stillman, the man who fought in lines 30 years before Linehammer was even thought of, is more relevant today than he's ever been before. So turn off Babe Station and sit on your hands. We'll crush our masters later in an orgy of unrelenting violence. But for now, doff your red-starred beret and hush, while we speak in hallowed tones about the ultimate spirit of wargaming. So let's remind ourselves what the philosophical moral treatise of Stillmania actually compelled us to do. First, thou should pick thine army to just under 2,000 points. Write down the roster and never amend it again. Make sure it fits the background. Collect and paint the army, give it 3 coats of gloss varnish, and never touch it with a paintbrush again. Give every character and regiment a name. Do not possess extra or alternative units, just stick with what you've got. Make a carrying case that fits the army exactly. Fight every battle with the same army and never change anything in it. Fighting big games with just your 2,000 points, and to hell with the odds. Never vary or change the army in any way. Resist all temptation. Model every magic item on the character who carries it, no matter what it is. What you see in the army is what you get. Take that literally. Always give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. Who cares if your opponents know your army composition off by heart? Let the only surprises be in your deployment and your tactical moves. Shrug off defeat, learn the lessons, and keep on practicing. Play for the fun of playing. When you win, the excellence of your generalship, thy knight, will be beyond doubt. So I think that the Stillmania column, which of course was part of the Spirit of the Game article in June 1998 in White Dwarf 221, is very powerful because it represents what you like, a kind of a sort of an absolute moral position of how you should play not just Warhammer, but pretty much any gaming system with model soldiers. I think it's also gained more traction perhaps in recent years because it perhaps represents a kind of a cleansing fire, a holy water, an absolute antidote to what you might call a sort of metagamer nowadays. The metagamer obviously chases the metagame. They try and get what's powerful. They throw money at the hobby. Maybe they just try and 3D print armies or throw contrast paint onto stuff to try and, make stuff that's really competitive and just care only about winning. They're very divorced maybe from the narrative, from the story, and from that very nebulous concept, the spirit of the game. And the Stillman column represents, almost in a kind of ritualized, chanting kind of scripture, the absolute opposite of those things. Now, we could probably ask ourselves to start with, who was Nigel Stillman? Now, Nigel Stillman appeared in Games Workshop, I think it's about 1988, and was involved in making Warhammer 3rd edition. He wrote many of the 4th edition army books. He came out of an archaeological background and indeed an interest in historical gaming. Stillman never had anything to do with Warhammer 40,000. He was involved only with Warhammer Fantasy and then a variety of sort of terrain and kind of hobby articles. He was very well known in particular for his characterization of the Bretonnians when they got a new book in 5th edition, and had articles on how he collected and modelled a real classic Bretonnian kind of army. However, I think he's probably best known now for this Spirit of the Game column, because while he wasn't only just a designer, he also had these very strong and outspoken views that were almost philosophical on how you should approach the hobby. And as I say, they came from perhaps a slightly different kind of gaming sphere, from someone who had played a lot of historicals before, who was really immersed in what you might call just games of kind of model soldiers, rather than necessarily kind of GW. And so he was an old wise head even then, and had very outspoken views. And this Spirit of the Game column was absolutely not presented as being a mainstream position you should adopt. Even in the context of those times, where the debate on Spirit of the Game, hence the article that this column is from, was very much alive, and was very much probably pointing towards Stillman, he was still regarded as something of an eccentric and something of a purist, whose views should be taken as wise counsel, but perhaps not interpreted literally. Now, with these kind of injunctions on how you should be the ultimate wargamer, the ultimate spirit of wargaming, I think there are a number of points we can make when we sort of analyse these. Now, to be a Stillmaniac in 1998, or indeed a Stillmaniac now, would of course first of all mean that you had to be completely impervious to the metagame. Because you are not allowed to change your army in any way, you can't adopt and adapt to the fact that suddenly you're fighting a lot of wood elves, say, at your local club, or suddenly there are big new kind of characters in town, or dragons, and you kind of need cannons. You can't do any of those things. You are a prisoner to the original army. And so, you're simply down really to luck as to whether you're getting kind of good matchups or not. I mean, to be able to play in this way, to never vary your army, no matter what happens, no matter how many times you kind of get smashed by, an evolving metagame, is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Because it's going to mean, first of all, as we'll come to later, that you're probably going to lose most of the time. It's also just going to simply mean that you're not really able to pursue a bunch of strategies or explore angles of the game that you would be able to explore with different kind of troop types. If you've got no artillery, then you're not going to have the main kind of antidote that there are to dragons. You're just going to have to find other ways of doing it. Now, the idea of conceptually chasing a metagame is just something that's so kind of baked into the hobby of now. Everyone is always asking a question, well, what's good? What's powerful? What's good value for points? And that's something which is, of course, greatly accelerated by the internet. By the fact that you can go and you can read about Warhammer or Warhammer 40,000 or whatever kind of gaming system there is, and find out what the kind of best builds are, what the top players who have gone to tournaments are taking, and perhaps adapt and kind of model your army on that kind of knowledge. Now, of course, in 1998, when this article was published, that wasn't really there. The first grand tournaments were starting to happen, but in this age before the internet, there was no real kind of meta knowledge. What there was, of course, would be some perhaps local kind of meta that you might go to your gaming club and, talk to other players and work out sort of what was good. You might seek, I suppose, a kind of a counter to some of the stuff that other players at that club were playing. But, this was all kind of very localized. But even that, even the adaptation to what you might call a localized meta, never mind just copying the sort of top tournament players, even Stillman is advocating against that you should exist in your own kind of sort of cocoon, follow your own kind of moral injunctions, and not adapt even to what people are doing in your own kind of localized club cell. So I think that this metagame point was actually a quite stern injunction even in 1998, because as I say, it would mean that you couldn't adapt. Now, even worse, because your modal kind of opponent is almost certainly going to have read some stuff online about what's good and what isn't, and is going to have adapted his army to fit. So you'll probably be at an even greater disadvantage against a more optimized opposition if you don't change your list than you would have been in the old days of 1998. Now, one of the other points, or the second point I think about Stillmania that is so interesting to me, is this point about the 3 coats of gloss varnish. Now, this is something that is very frequently mocked. The idea that, first of all, gloss varnish isn't a fashionable thing to stick on your models nowadays, because that's not really the look, obviously. But it means that if you put 3 coats of gloss varnish in something and never touch it with a paintbrush again, you turn it into an ossified time capsule, a prisoner for all eternity of the way you painted and the way you modeled at that particular time. You're not able to go and change it later. You're not able to, as you improve in your painting skills, tidy it up a little bit. No, it speaks simply to that time on its own. And I think there's something actually very, very powerful about that
perhaps has escaped some people's sort of superficial first impressions of this. Now, why would you make an army a prisoner to a particular time in your gaming and your hobbying career? Well, I think there's a kind of an integrity to this. That, like an artist who perhaps paints work that he's very, very proud of as a young man, he doesn't go back when he's a wiser and more experienced artist and go and kind of tidy it up later. No, he keeps it how it was because that was something he was proud of at the time. And keeping an army as it was at the time that you sort of painted it means that it represents your sort of level of kind of painting skill, and also just a whole bunch of ideas about sort of aesthetics and the hobby that existed at the time that you painted it. So it becomes something that almost represents a stage of your life, a stage of the hobby, and also a stage of you as someone who's a painter and a modeler. So then, it becomes, a little bit like, an old heirloom, or, as I say, an old piece of work that you're proud of. It doesn't evolve with you, it stays there as part of the museum to your life thus far. And that's obviously not something that's going to be to everyone's tastes, but I think there's a quite powerful temporal point about that from Stillman, that the army should reflect you and the time that you lived in and the time that you gamed in, and, to evolve with the times, start a new army, do new kind of painting techniques, but keep the one that existed at that time as being what it was then, and go and do something new rather than just continually changing everything. The third thing, background and naming characters. Now, this really, I think, relates to what you might call narrative gaming broadly conceived. Now, there's always a debate that takes place, in Warhammer about narrative versus competitive. And of course, most players are not narrative or competitive as kind of binaries. They're usually somewhere in between. To be a pure gamist, to not care at all about the models that are on the table, other than as playing pieces with which to kill your opponent, or someone who doesn't give a damn about the result, just rolls the dice and doesn't really care so long as everyone has a good time. Now, there are players that are like that in both camps, but most people are somewhere between the two. That they like to try and play the game and try and win. They like the tactical challenge of that. But they also care, about the narrative. They also want to imagine, a sort of a horde of orcs storming into a tower, or some pristine knights charging with their kind of great long lances. That there's something powerful about that too. Now, what Stillman is, of course, advocating is something that's more pure narrative in its nature. Now, of course, remember that Warhammer Fantasy Battle, came out of a role-playing tradition. It came out of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And the first two editions, and to some extent even the third edition as well, had one foot very much in the world of role-playing. It must be remembered that these editions even required you to have a games master, a third player. So they weren't trying to simulate a kind of a competitive game. The rules for mass combat and mass battles were part of broader kind of adventures. Perhaps you would have, an individual or a party-based role-playing game in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay system. And then there might come a moment where you fight a battle, and the Warhammer Fantasy Battle rules enable you to simulate that. In other words, a battle in a role-playing universe. Now, of course, while this very much turned, and was changing, undoubtedly, even in 3rd edition, despite that remaining presence of the GM, there was still, I think, a certain kind of instability about whether Warhammer was a narrative or a competitive game, or somewhere in between, that has never really been fully resolved. Now, obviously, when you make an army fit the background, that's quite interesting, because what do we mean by background? So, if you've got a Dark Elf army and it's from Hagenath, then perhaps you have just executioners in your army, or you have a lot of executioners, and you don't use, for example, witch elves, or, some other troop types that might come from other different places. That's one thing, to place an army, on a map, and maybe indeed in a particular time on the Warhammer timeline. It's often, I think, forgotten that, with army books, say, in the age of 4th edition and 5th edition, there was perhaps, to a smaller extent, a kind of a current moment, so to speak, which is in 8th ed, or indeed Warhammer the Old World, they're set at a particular time. In 8th edition, it's on the brink of collapse, the world. It's Archaon getting his stuff, and, it's set a particular time, place in the timeline. In Old World, that's also true. It just takes place at an earlier point. But in 4th edition and 5th edition, if you even looked at, say, the special characters that existed, they lived at different times in the Warhammer timeline. And so there was the idea that not only when you fought your Warhammer battle would you be sort of setting it in a place, you would also be setting it in a particular time. And so that might also reflect, some of the troop choices that you make. For example, if you were a dwarf army and you wanted to, pick an army that perhaps looked as though it was from the War of the Beard, you wouldn't have so many, or as far as I'm aware, indeed any at all, black powder weapons that would have existed at that time. Because they either, and I forget this, and excuse me there on the dwarf lore, they either didn't exist or that they were much scarcer. So that might also determine whether your army fitted the background. Another point about this is that it's not just about the background that Games Workshop produce themselves. It's about a background that you've decided. If you decide that you're going to make an army that's of a particular kind of theme, that's got nothing to do with the sort of Warhammer universe. If you want to make a kind of a power metal kind of chaos army, and you want to just have all the dudes carrying electric guitars, and has absolutely nothing to do with the actual stuff that you might find in the sort of chaos army books, fine, great. It's a background that you've invented. And that, of course, comes back to the whole role-playing tradition, which is that Warhammer battles are stories, and they're things that exist while Games Workshop will give you a sort of a head start and will give you narrative background. They also can exist in your head as well. And that means that you can build upon what they've given you or ignore it and just do something completely different. Indeed, even in the Stillmanian tradition, you could even make up rules for certain kind of units. I mean, one games designer, I think it might have been Rick Priestley who said this, and I apologize if I've misquoted this, but he said that he wasn't disappointed when people make up the rules. He was disappointed when people didn't make them up, which is to say that the purpose of the rules is to act as a springboard for better and greater things. And that means games of the imagination and games of the mind. And really, those, for Stillman certainly, were much more important than the actual kind of mechanized game that existed on the table. So when Stillman was saying you need to fit the background, and name your characters, of course, that's a bit more obvious, he's saying that primarily here, it's a story, not a game. And, the game, as I say, exists as something that's subservient to that kind of story. And, act as something that helps make it real and make it substantiated. Now, another point I think is important from the Stillman point, the carrying case. You make your custom carrying case, you don't even have, those extra kind of alternative kind of units. And that perhaps also represents something, I think, also that's quite narrative in its nature. The first point is that, in historical battles, or battles in, Warhammer history, very rarely were they fought between equal or matched sides. Very rarely was there the concept of 2,000 points. Indeed, in many, examples of military history, it's part of the whole point that the forces are unbalanced. Because, one general perhaps has got the wood over the other and has sent in twice as many men as the other. And, the other guy might be trying to sort of, get out with as much as he can, or try to, evacuate his troops from the battlefield. Only rarely were there actually, say, two very equal kind of armies in sort of a pitched battle. And if we think about fantasy stories and fantasy tales, very often it's, the good is holding out against, insurmountable odds, backs to the wall against, the marauding forces of chaos, and perhaps winning a great victory that is rendered great precisely because it was something that was achieved against the odds. So if you're playing in big games with just your 2,000 points, then you're able to simulate that perhaps a little bit more accurately, or perhaps a little bit more fulfillingly than you would do if things were simply kind of matched. So I think that has a very strong impact upon the kind of narrative of a game that you're potentially being able to put there on the table. Next, the point about competitiveness. Now, he says, give the opponent the benefit of the doubt. Now, in other places, Stillman had written quite a lot about what he viewed to be the spirit of the game from a competitive perspective. And to be honest, this whole point could probably be a video in and of itself. So, beardiness and cheesiness. These were two terms that were in contemporary circulation in White Dwarf 221 and before. To be beardy is to try and play the rules rather than the game. To try to find all sorts of ways of exploiting the mechanization of the games to give yourself an unfair advantage. Like, for example, just kind of clipping charges, lining up your troops behind something you think is going to pursue so they bounce through them. In other words, what perhaps latterly became called gaminess. Beardiness was perhaps the terminology there. As to why a beardy player, a guy with a long beard, should be someone who's like that, I'm not entirely sure why, but, there are perhaps some, overlaps there with the concept of being a neckbeard, for example. To be cheesy, as another piece of terminology. Now, cheesy is different from beardy. To be cheesy is to pick the most extreme kind of army list you possibly can that is designed perfectly to win and to destroy your opponent. 6 bolt throwers, 3 griffins, whatever. The most extreme version of the list that you can. Now, often, cheesy players were also beardy as well. But not only would you have the super cheesy army, you would also try and, crush your opponent by sort of exploiting the rules in that way. But that didn't necessarily have to be the case. I've sometimes played as a gamer players who are as cheesy as hell in terms of what they brought to the table, but are actually kind of really relaxed in the way they play the game. And then you've got someone who's probably a bit more like me, who often picks very soft armies, but tries to play them in the way that gives him the best chance of winning. And that perhaps, is maybe a bit more beardy from the beardy tradition. But for Stillman, you're not going to be beardy, you're not going to be cheesy. You're always going to give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. So, is that unit in arc or not? Is that a 9-inch or an 8-inch charge? Always give the opponent the benefit of the doubt. If your opponent forgets to do something, like if he gets to move something, or he, casts a spell out of order in Warhammer the Old World, which is a very common mistake in the new game, you let him go back and do it. And, perhaps even you don't, if you make a mistake like that, you don't necessarily ask to go back and do it yourself. Perhaps if your opponent lets you do it, then that's another matter. And of course, if you're very sporting to him, he's likely to also be very sporting to you as well. So there's that kind of idea about really sort of gaming in a very sort of consensual kind of environment that also I think is perhaps also given greater power by the fact that your opponent is always going to know your army list with Stillmania, because there aren't therefore going to be those kind of gotcha sort of moments if your opponent knows your army composition by heart. And even if it was your first game against the army, I dare say that Stillman would tell you probably exactly what everything did. And in any case, all the magic items are already modelled on the characters anyway, and so many of the gotcha moments are probably removed by dint of that. Now, the beardy and the cheesy point, I think it is worth remembering, in the context of the hobby at that time in the late 90s, was really being pushed back against in White Dwarf. That there was a concept that in that time of 5th edition, because you could bend the rules so much, because there were potential powerful heroes especially that you could create that were absolutely lethal, pretty much I suppose as bad or arguably worse as the ones you're currently getting with Warhammer the Old World, what goes around comes around in this respect, that, there was, I suppose, almost a sort of what you call an anti-kind of cheese narrative that was pushed in White Dwarf. Now, in the very last article, before the end of an era, 4th edition and 5th edition, and before the new age of 6th edition, where you weren't allowed to pick these cheesy heroes anymore, where there were so much fewer magic items, where no longer were you being trusted to be a gentleman and not bring the cheesy Dragon Lord, you simply were not allowed to, him and a level 4 wizard, and he wasn't as good. There was an article in this issue before that was about being beardy, and it was showcasing beardy army lists, cheesy army lists, I should say, that were designed almost to laugh at, almost to show the absurdities to which the game could be pushed an issue before it was all over and 6th edition appeared. I know this because I submitted a list myself to that competition, which consisted of nearly 300 flagellants. Some of the armies that appeared in that article, that were there, I suppose, to showcase the higher limits of cheesiness, were perverse in the extreme. There was one that I think was 23 snotling pump wagons, with lots of Night Goblin Shaman that could all store power cards so that you could almost take the whole magic deck off the table and have it in Night Goblin Shamans, with a Necromancer that kind of stopped people moving, and then the wagons ran people over. One that had, 15 cockatrices that all just auto-killed things on 6s. It was a chamber of horrors of cheesiness. And, in some respects, Stillman was a little bit ahead of his time there, that there was this rebellion against, being able to take the most cheesy and overpowered armies with 6th edition, which dialed back the range of options quite dramatically in terms of what you were actually able to bring to the table. Although I think for Stillman, whether he would have agreed with 6th edition or not, I'm not quite sure, because I think the point of the Stillman view is that you can take the cheese, that it's there and you choose not to, because you're a gentleman, rather than being stopped from taking the cheese completely. Next is, I think, the anti-commercialism of this whole Stillmania piece. If you're not buying any new models, you're not buying any new paint, you're not chasing the meta in any way at all, you're just having 2,000 points and not possessing any alternative units, you are, if you like, simply existing in a world where you're not buying anything. You have your initial purchases and then you don't add anything to your army at all. Now, for a gaming company which is in the business of selling model soldiers, obviously everything they should pump in their official publications is buy. Buy the latest release. Buy this. It's really powerful, etc. Treat yourself, guys. Spend money in Games Workshop, etc. As well as telling you to make your own kind of terrain, Stillman is also saying don't buy models as well. He's also very much an advocate of conversion as well, which also meant that you could reuse parts of older models. And so it seems amazing that, such a view was being pushed in White Dwarf magazine because, they would essentially be saying, don't buy, just stick with what you've got. And that's one of the little things where there's a little bit of puff of magic powder there. A little bit of feeling the winds of nostalgia. To remember a time when even by the mid-90s, which was when this was written, even then, Games Workshop and Warhammer had become like a mass market product. It wasn't the heroic age of transgressive power metal and punks of the 80s, where there was an altogether different, more edgy vibe in town. This was the 90s, where it was still, a mass market product. The decade where I was bought Warhammer in Toys R Us. And even in that era, even at the end of the 90s, you've still got someone in White Dwarf saying, don't buy extra models, just stick with what you've got, guys. And, there's something there, I think, of perhaps the dying embers of perhaps White Dwarf as being a real hobbyist's magazine, and as this being a real kind of hobbyist's hobby, rather than a springboard to, to rocket up the Games Workshop's share price and just sell as many, models as possible. And that's, I think, something which, casts a long shadow and doesn't die easily in people's minds. And it's part of the reason why when people who remember the 90s and the 80s wax lyrical about how great Warhammer was then, it's part of what they mean. That it wasn't really just a company thinking commercially, that there was an animating magic here, and they wanted to create a really great hobby space, as well as light up the world with satire, with, transgressive kinds of influences, with new ideas of kind of the aesthetics of how they wanted, say, chaos to look or how they wanted games to feel, which was the case in the 80s as well. There's still some of that there even by the late 90s, even though perhaps it wasn't to last very much longer. Next, I think, is the very obvious point here with all of, or many of these points of Stillmania, which is you're going to lose. If you fight in big battles with just what you've got, if you don't possess any alternative units, if you make your army into a prisoner of how you first thought that it should be when you drew up the list, when you didn't really know what was good and what wasn't, you're going to be fighting you're going to be using a suboptimal list. It's not going to be chasing the meta at all. It's not going to be able to adapt itself, and it's going to be outnumbered in bigger games. It's going to mean you're going to lose, probably more often than not. Perhaps you might almost never win. But again, that's part of the point. The fact is that you're not playing the game to win. Sure, you're trying to win when you've got your troops on the table and trying to, make clever maneuvers and tactical moves, by all means. But at the end of the day, you're primarily here to play for the fun of playing. And, there's again a very idealistic kind of injunction kind of there, which is that while this is a game of dice and while it's a game that does take skill to play, that you're also really playing primarily for the fun of playing. And in that case, it doesn't really matter if you lose. And if you are able to win, carrying all of these self-imposed burdens, then you might be rather a good player. And perhaps more importantly than a good player, a good man, a good gentleman, the kind of person who, others might really want to play. An ambassador of the hobby, the kind of person who will get new people interested and involved. That's what it's trying to say there. That, this is a game that's also, about that, as well as just simply a kind of a war game. Finally, I think there's the kind of tragic heroism to all this. And of course, this is why it's so popular. Statements of sort of absolute moral conviction which can't actually be lived in actuality by mortal men are, of course, deeply enthralling, because they are impossible, and they are statements of moral absolutism, which are always popular wherever you tend to find them. It requires a player to play out of the loop. You're not chasing the meta, you're not buying any more units, and even out of time as well. That you're not evolving to, new stuff that's been released. You start your Wood Elf army and the Glade Rider models aren't out. It means you just don't have any Glade Riders and you can't get any more. Now, this is an ideal which, pretty much anyone will fail if they pursue it. That you're playing, as I say, out of loop and out of time, and you're having to divorce yourself completely from those things. And, in the late 90s, that was hard. Today, it's hard as well. Because, you might want to be part of, obviously, the wargaming narrative to, to be responsive to when new kind of things come out. Partly just to share in the kind of excitement or enjoyment of, say, a new release, or to get hold of a new model that's, perhaps exciting to you and you fancy like painting. All of these things you have to reject if you're going to be a Stillmaniac. You have to, I suppose, simply just exist in your own kind of time, in your own space, in your own Grail chapel, so to speak. And almost the fact that everyone who tries this will fail at it is part of the attraction. Because, of course, there's nothing so noble about an impossible quest. Now, I've said all of this, and it probably looks as though I'm extolling Stillmania, and in some ways I am. I'm extolling it as a point of moral purity. I'm extolling it as a very, very clear and very, very powerful moral statement, which rings true precisely because it is the antidote of so much of what Games Workshop has become in later times. But at the same time, I also think it misses some very important things. And they're not the kind of the obvious stuff, like saying the 3 coats of gloss varnish is finished, is stupid, or at least impossible to achieve at any rate. It's more something else, which is that this Stillmaniac set of vows is like a knight going on a quest, and probably an impossible one. But you see, playing Warhammer in the late 90s, or playing it today, or indeed playing any game, it's not just about that in itself. It's not just about you and the hobby, as a sort of an individual detached enterprise. It's a game of men as well as model soldiers. A game of other players. And that is also something I think that's probably even greater than the story. That's even greater than the game. The fact that there are other players there involved. And, you might be playing with a crowd of players who want to, share in the evolving meta. They want to have and introduce the kind of latest sort of models to the gaming table. They want you, if they're playing a 3,000 point game, to also play 3,000 points, so you're going to have a chance rather than just playing a kind of a lopsided game because you're just so into your Stillmaniac kind of philosophy. Also, while the perversions of sort of beardy or kind of cheesy play are not to everyone's tastes, there is also something, certainly I think, very amusing about those things. That, the tricks and the traps of playing a kind of a game of Warhammer and some of the ridiculous situations that you can kind of get into on a gaming table, there's a certain perverse fun to some of kind of that. And the fact that some things are wild, some things are swingy, is in some respects also part of the point. And so sometimes if you play with a certain group of players, they might quite like the idea of cheesiness and beardiness. That might be something that they quite enjoy. And that's the crucial point. It depends on who you're playing, doesn't it? Perhaps the real skill, in my view, is to realise that when you're playing a game like Warhammer, you're not just playing it as an individual, ploughing his own furrow, impervious to the outside world. You're playing it in the world of now. And that's why, even though I might be very critical about Warhammer the Old World, for example, it's still my game, because it's today's Warhammer. So that doesn't mean I think it's better, and that doesn't mean that I don't think that playing Warhammer in 1989 or 1995 or 2004 wasn't better than now. I dare say all of those would have been better. The fact is that I am now a man of this time and of this place. And I play a game with other players. And that means that I've got to play something that they want to play in a manner that they enjoy. And if those players are more competitive or more kind of meta-y, I can see beauty in that. I can play that game. But at the same time, if there's a new player in the club and, he's a Stillmaniac and he wants to play that kind of Warhammer, I think that the ultimate wargamer will have the flexibility to be able to do that. He will be able to put his competitive stuff away and be able to enjoy a pure fluff kind of narrative game one week, and then the next, play an absolutely daggers out, cutthroat cheese game the next, because it's what his opponent wants, and because it enables you to share a communal and exciting and enriching kind of experience over a gaming table with another player. And as I say, that's more important than the rules and the game, and it's more important than the hobby and the narrative. The fact that what you're doing is playing with others, and making friends, rather than, just, I suppose, being involved in the actual kind of hobby itself. So that's why I don't agree with Stillman. Even though I admire what he's saying as a kind of a statement of pure moral absolutism, if you like, and can completely understand why what he's saying is so kind of idolized. I think there's a great deal of truth in what he says, and I think that gamers should, read the Stillman canon insofar as it exists, and consider, how they think about the spirit of the game, and, have that kind of conversation with themselves, conversation with their opponent, and talk about it. That having a conversation about what we think about what a war game should be, and where the different balance between the sort of narrative and competitive elements appear, is all part of that discourse. Stillman was advocating an extreme position, and he knew he was advocating an extreme position. He didn't think it was the only position. He didn't think it was the only legitimate position. But he was just providing a very, very powerful, a very strongly expressed view that represented one kind of end of the moral spectrum. And that's why it's so powerful. But I think it's best used as something to talk about and something to think about the hobby, rather than something that should be inscribed in tablets of stone. For those who really want to be a Stillmaniac, you don't need to make your opponents be Stillmaniacs. You don't need to carve it on a tablet of stone. You just need to carve it on your heart and be a Stillmaniac yourself. That's all, and that's enough.
So, punks, what do you think of Nigel Stillman? Was he wide of the mark, or was the mark wide of him? Are you a Stillmaniac, or maybe only occasionally one on Sunday morning? All I can tell you is this. In the anti-iconoclastic terror that would represent the consolidation of power after the revolution, I would build a statue of Nigel Stillman somewhere in Nottingham. I wonder where we should put it.